A strange story happened to my friend Brian. One night, while driving down Highway 101 through vineyards and fields, he noticed scarecrows in the fields as he approached Greenfield, California. At first, he didn't think much of it, but upon closer inspection, he realized that something was off. When was the last time you saw a scarecrow on industrial farms? Brian pulled over to the side of the road and went into the field. As he approached the scarecrow, he realized it was not made of straw and cloth, but of human hair and skin. A shiver ran down his spine as he turned back to his car and saw a woman with long black hair standing closer to the hills, watching him. She waved with both hands and asked him to come closer, but Brian was paralyzed with fear. He tried to get back to his car but stumbled and lost consciousness. The next morning, Brian woke up at the police station. He was found sleeping and covered in sticky mud with a bunch of long black hair on 7th Street. During police questioning, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that the woman with the long black hair was still watching him through the mirror in the interrogation room. Eventually, he was released and returned home. His car was in the garage, but Brian felt a chill down his back as he got in and felt the woman's cold hands on his shoulders, hearing her voice in his head saying, "Sell the car, sell the car, sell the car." But he overcame his fear and drove to his brother's house. The woman disappeared as if she were never there. A week later, Brian sold his car and never encountered the ghostly woman again. This is a horrifying story that happened in the state of Oklahoma to a man named John Williams. He and his girlfriend Sarah went on a 2-month trip to the wild places. They set up their temporary camp in the Kiamishi Mountains. At night, John heard through his sleep as if something or someone was approaching them, like some ominous shadow from a forgotten nightmare. Then this shadow glides along the walls of the tent, filling the space, and the tent becomes stuffy and cramped. John felt a sticky, wet, and burning touch on his hand and a low chest voice murmuring something incoherent. John couldn't understand if he was dreaming or hearing this for real. Anxiety was growing, and this unpleasant feeling was pulsing in his head. The voice began to fade, and John opened his eyes. He looked around carefully. There was no one in the tent except Sarah. But John was uneasy and felt dizzy. His hand burned as if from a bite, so he decided to examine it, but suddenly he heard a strange noise outside. He got out of the tent and saw a figure standing in the shadow. The creature was tall and thin, although it was poorly visible, with long fingers or tentacles and sunken black eyes. John felt a wave of fear engulf him, but he forced himself to stay calm, hoping to photograph the strange creature. But when he raised the camera, the creature rushed towards John, grabbed him, lifted him up in the air, and threw him to the ground. John lay on the ground, not feeling any pain, but sensing that he was dealing with something beyond his understanding. He knew he couldn't handle the creature alone, but he was determined to protect Sarah at any cost. The creature, however, was relentless in its pursuit and continued to attack John. With a stick in hand, John blocked the entrance to the tent where Sarah was, hoping to buy her some time to escape. He could hear Sarah's cries behind him. John began to strike back, but a sudden pain in his eyes, as if someone was pouring boiling water into them, and his injured hand hanging limply, prevented him from delivering precise and strong blows. He resisted with all his might, determined to defend himself to the end. The creature seemed to be amused by John's bravery, like a predator playing with its prey before feeding. In the midst of the tense struggle, John stumbled and fell, and that's when Sarah, in her all-encompassing anger, took a decisive step. She grabbed a burning stick from the fire, ran closer, and began to wave it in front of the monster's face. She saw tiny mat-white eyes without pupils deep in its black sockets. From the bright light, the creature roared and stepped back from John. In complete desperation, Sarah ran closer, forgetting caution, and began waving the fire in front of the creature again. Venting her anger, Sarah continued waving the fire, and the monster retreated and disappeared. Sarah stood still for a few seconds, clenching the torch and waiting for the creature's attack, but it dissolved into darkness. Sarah rushed to John. What she saw defied all description. John's body was glowing bright blue neon, and he was kneeling, trying to stand up. Sarah didn't know how to help John. She was overwhelmed with horror. As Sarah looked at him, she felt that John was boiling inside. His body was changing, stretching, cracking, and a thick blue liquid started pouring out of him. John slowly melted away in a pool of glowing blue slime. Sarah knelt before John, crying and praying, but inside her, rage mixed with fear and hopelessness. Dark clouds drifted across the sky, illuminated by a bright bloody moon. Looking at John's remains, Sarah could not believe the nightmare of the night. Dawn came, and suddenly Sarah heard a faint, drawn-out howl from deep in the forest. "You will regret it, Sarah." Henry was a young man who was always looking for new adventures. One day he stumbled upon a secluded, beautiful cottage in the woods and could not resist the urge to explore it. Approaching the cottage, he noticed that the door was slightly ajar and cautiously stepped inside. Inside, he found a hunched old woman sitting by the fireplace, her gaze fixed on the flickering blue flame. Despite her appearance, Henry was drawn to her, enjoying their privacy. Over the next few weeks, Henry visited the old woman frequently, and they sat in silence for hours, enjoying each other's company. In the end, he even moved into a cottage. However, as Henry got closer to the old woman, strange things began to happen. He caught a glimpse of ghostly figures in the forest and heard whispers in his ear even in the middle of the day. He felt like he was being watched, and he couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. Once, when he was sitting with an old woman by the fireplace, she revealed her secret to him. She told him that she practiced dark magic and cast a spell on him to make him fall in love with her. Henry was horrified, but he could not resist the old woman's power over him. Gradually, she began to suck out his vitality, and every day he became more and more pale and transparent. One day a large number of ghosts came to the cottage from the forest. He learned that these ghosts were the old woman's former lovers. Henry couldn't handle his feelings of jealousy. When the ghosts retired into the forest, he found a knife in a velvet chest and killed the old woman with it. People who pass by the cottage to this day report a strange, unsettling feeling. Some say they still see Henry's ghost. Bloody, he wanders through the forest with a knife in his hand in search of a girl who will agree to live with him in a cottage. Once in a local cafe, a girl sat down with me and asked, "Are you Steve Gloom?" She fiddled with a torn napkin while she spoke. The girl had strange bluish scars on her arms and unusually old hands. I nodded in response to her question. She then started, "It happened in Indiana, along Highway 10. And I listened to her story without interrupting. She, Elizabeth, a young journalist, was determined to uncover the truth behind the rumors of the old man's peculiar behavior and the strange collection of photographs that adorned the walls of his home. As she pushed open the gate, she was immediately struck by the overwhelming aura of dread that surrounded the mansion. The air was thick with a supernatural energy, and she could sense the eyes of some unseen entity upon her. When she entered the house, she was immediately struck by the sheer volume of photographs that adorned the walls. Each picture was black and white and depicted an image of death and decay, from car wrecks to decomposing bodies. The air was heavy with the smell of burning meat. As she walked deeper into the house, Elizabeth noticed that the old man was in the center of the room, surrounded by candles. In front of him, on an altar, was a large knife that was covered in blood. He was convulsing and shouting out some words in a language unknown to her, and appeared to be conducting some kind of ritual. Suddenly, the old man's eyes locked onto Elizabeth, and she felt a strange feeling of dread wash over her. Before she could react, he lunged at her with the knife. She managed to dodge his attack, but he managed to slice her arm. As she stumbled backwards, she saw that the old man had no eyes and his skin was covered in dark, oily veins. Elizabeth was desperate to escape the house, but the old man was relentless in his pursuit. He chased her from room to room, determined to capture her. She managed to grab a candlestick and hit the old man over the head, knocking him unconscious. She stumbled out of the house and was blinded by a bright flash. When Elizabeth woke up, she was lying in a field many miles from the old man's house. Her body scarred from strange marks carved into her skin. And when she returned to the city, she was shocked to find that the once dilapidated house had turned into ruins, as if 20 years had passed. The townspeople did not remember either the old man or the events that took place in the house, but Elizabeth was sure of what she had experienced. Years later, Elizabeth told her story to me, Steve Gloom, an expert in supernatural incidents. As she finished her story, Elizabeth's eyes were haunted by the horror she faced, and I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. I've heard many stories of the supernatural, but this one was especially disturbing, and I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets still lurk in the shadows of our world. Lila had fallen into a swift stream which had not been in this place of the small river before. It was impossible to get out of the current, even though she swam well. She felt an unknown force pressing on her, forcing her to sink deeper and deeper into the whirlpool. Struggling to stay afloat, Lila weakened every moment, as if she were entangled in a web that drained her strength and paralyzed her mind. She was unable to resist this unknown brute force, and visions began to appear in front of her. She saw a cemetery and a young woman on the shore in a black dress. She felt her gaze. The woman in the black dress was showing her a freshly dug grave, as if trying to tell her something. Then the woman headed along the riverbank, approaching the place where Lila was drowning. On the other side of the shore, Lila saw another young woman who was hard to see. It seemed to her that the ghost of the woman was holding a baby in her hands. This woman was wearing a white dress, and she too walked towards her. Lila's eyes closed, and she still saw a woman in a wedding dress in the water next to her. Lila lost consciousness, but at the last moment, she heard the cry of a baby and felt someone grab her and forcefully drag her to the shore. It was her boyfriend Jay. When she woke up, Jay claimed that he had come to the river and saw how Lila was drowning and pulled her out of the water. He also said that he did not see these women. Lila was sure of the opposite and looked for the girl in the white dress with her eyes, but could not find her. Jay took Lila to his house that evening and cooked dinner. Lila was silent. The images of the two ghosts in black and white bothered her. She couldn't calm down and wanted Jay to take her home. Jay insisted that she stay with him. At night, Lila woke up from feeling this unknown force again. This time it felt like something was trying to strangle her. She saw that it was some kind of gray shadow. Everything repeated as in the daytime drowning. She saw an old cemetery, and her strength was running out. The gray shadow influenced her mind so that she was unable to scream to wake Jay. Then everything happened like in a nightmare. She felt like she had fallen into an infinite unknown space of time where unknown forces were fighting for her life and death. Lila thought that she was dreaming all of this, or that it was nonsense that arose in her head because she did not believe in ghosts. There was no agreement between the gray shadow and the ghost in white. Their movements were sharp, flickering all over the room, along the walls, on the ceiling. Objects trembled, and pictures on the walls swayed. She was well aware that she was not sleeping and could clearly see how the second hand of a large clock was moving on the wall. The fight of the ghosts continued, and none of them were victorious. Then Lila heard the cry of the baby, and everything stopped. Lila did not sleep until morning, waiting for the ghosts to appear again, but they never did. In the morning, she was silent, pondering everything that had happened. The night's events seemed like a dream, but she kept thinking about them. Probably, I have psychosis because of the incident on the river, Lila thought, and decided to go to the doctor. She knew that such symptoms were manifested in schizophrenics, and she was very worried about this. She did not tell the doctor that she had seen ghosts on the river and in Jay's bedroom. Lila felt that her story would look absurd. However, the doctor determined that the girl had severe overwork and prescribed sleeping pills. The doctor also advised her to avoid the river for some time and forget the unpleasant incident. To relieve stress, Lila took up yoga. She tried not to spend the night in Jay's apartment and found various reasons so that Jay would not be offended. Over time, strange incidents with ghosts were forgotten. The relationship between Lila and Jay grew stronger, and Jay eventually proposed to her. Lila moved into his house. On Sunday, Jay had some work in the garage, so Lila decided to cook dinner. She could not find salt and began to look for it on all the kitchen shelves. Lila accidentally saw an old book on cooking. With great interest, she carefully leafed through it and skimmed through the recipes. In the middle of the book, she saw a yellowed leaf. It was a letter addressed to Jay from a medical trainee who worked with a doctor in the surgery department. As Lila began to read the letter, her horror grew with each new sentence. She knew for certain that she wasn't sleeping and could clearly see the second hand of a large clock ticking on the wall. The ghostly battle continued without a clear victor until suddenly Lila heard the cry of a baby and everything came to a halt. Lila stayed up all night, waiting for the ghosts to appear again, but they never did. The next morning she was quiet, pondering everything that had happened. The events of the previous night felt like a dream, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were real. Maybe I'm experiencing some sort of psychosis from the incident on the river, Lila thought, and decided to go see a doctor. She knew that symptoms like hers were often seen in people with schizophrenia, and she was very worried. She didn't tell the doctor about the ghosts she saw on the river or in Jay's bedroom, thinking that it would sound too absurd. However, the doctor diagnosed her with severe exhaustion and prescribed sleeping pills, cautioning her not to go to the river for a while and advising her to forget about the unpleasant incident. To help alleviate her stress, Lila took up yoga. She also tried not to spend the night at Jay's apartment, finding various excuses so as not to offend him. Eventually, the strange incidents with the ghosts were forgotten, and Lila and Jay's relationship grew stronger. Jay proposed to her, and she moved into his house. One Sunday, while Jay was busy working in the garage, Lila decided to cook dinner. She couldn't find the salt and began to search for it on all the kitchen shelves. In the process, she stumbled upon an old cookbook and started leafing through it, carefully perusing the recipes. In the middle of the book, she found a yellowed page that turned out to be a letter addressed to Jay from a medical intern who worked with a surgeon. Lila began reading the letter, and with each sentence, her horror grew. "I don't know if this letter will reach you, but I hope it does," the letter read. "If you're the same Jay I'm looking for, then please read on. The Jay I'm searching for is around 30 years old, tall, dark-haired, and I believe he lives in this city. His girlfriend, Elizabeth, had been living in Washington recently. That's all I know about him." Sadly, a girl repeated his name until the very moment of her death. The letter went on to say that Elizabeth had been found with injuries in a locked apartment. Neighbors discovered her there after hearing muffled screams, the medical intern wrote. They called the police, and when they arrived, they found her in a critical condition, multiple fractures, wounds, and unexplained burns on her body, as well as sepsis. She was unconscious. She underwent several surgeries, and I volunteered to sit with her until her family arrived. This went on for a week. Then, she started to come around and was conscious for a minute or two. She asked, "Where's my child?" I tried to calm her down, but she was crying, and in the process, I learned her name, age, address, and where she had lived with her father. She cared for him during his last months until he passed away. She didn't remember what had happened to her, but she did recall that it was on the third day after her father's funeral that everything changed. Then she lost consciousness again. I reached out to her aunt, who confirmed the entire story about Elizabeth. That was my patient's name. When she sleeps, she often whispers the name Jay. But for some reason, I'm the only one who hears it. And since my boyfriend's name is also Jay and he works in the same hospital, no one believes me. I asked her aunt, but she didn't know any Jay and didn't know who they were talking about. I often went into her room. Once, while I was on duty near her, I accidentally fell asleep. And in my dream, I saw a place that I immediately recognized because my childhood passed in that city. I realized that Jay lives in that city. But I can't tell the police what I know because my dream isn't proof for them. I want Jay to know that Elizabeth was 8 months pregnant and they were expecting a boy. However, the child was nowhere to be found. When Elizabeth thrashes about, she often says, "You can't break me." More precisely, only I hear her say that. Her phone could provide many answers, but it's nowhere to be found. Jay, there's something strange about Elizabeth and your son's death. Her aunt gave me a small photo of Elizabeth. I've attached it to this letter. Lila couldn't believe this horror. She'd already read this letter several times, and she still couldn't come to her senses. In the photo, the face of that same ghost in a white dress was visible. Accidentally dropping her coffee cup on the table, Lila snapped out of her daze. A bad feeling haunted her. She ran into the room and found an album of photographs. Leafing through it, she saw one photo of a happy Jay and Elizabeth from about 10 years ago. In the next photo, Lila also recognized another woman in a black dress, Jay's previous wife, who died under strange circumstances, crashing into a tree while driving to Jay's hospital. Lila was frightened and couldn't fully comprehend these facts, although she knew for sure that both women were ghosts haunting the house. But her heart sank at the thought that Elizabeth had lost her child. Now I know why I hear the babies cry. It's my son's cry, thought Lila, looking at the photo. No, Lila heard and turned around. Near the window, a silhouette of a ghost, similar to Elizabeth, trembled strangely. No, it's your son crying. Take care of him and don't make the same mistakes as me, the ghost said. Does Jay's wife want me dead? Lila asked, but the ghost of Elizabeth had already vanished into the haze. Lila was confused. Why was her son crying? She did not know what to do, thoughts flickered, but she gathered courage and put all the albums on the shelf. She put the letter in a cookbook. If Jay has read this letter, why does he keep it in the kitchen? Either I'm going crazy or I don't understand something. But I need to understand, she thought. All night Lila cried quietly and was tormented by questions. Maybe it's all in my head, she thought. Maybe I'm sick? Could Jay be involved in these deaths? Maybe my wife's ghost is jealous of me and wants me dead? The next day, Lila found a fortune teller and went to her appointment. The young fortune teller, after listening to Lila, told her that there were not just 2 female ghosts in Jay's house, but a dozen. However, Catherine, Jay's wife, was not among them. She wants to enter the house, but she stayed on the road. This wasn't just an accident, it was a murder, and the spirit of Catherine knows the killer and wants revenge because she also read this letter. Some force keeps Catherine out of the house, and she has no desire to harm Lila. The ghosts present in the house are in a difficult struggle. Even if Lila leaves this house, it will haunt her, and she will most likely suffer the same fate as Elizabeth. But now they are all waiting for something. Suddenly, the fortune teller abruptly interrupted the session and said, "No more questions. I can't help you." At home, Lila began to feel sick and had a sharp pain in her lower abdomen. Jay thought her symptoms were similar to poisoning. Lila didn't argue, but she already knew what was wrong with her. Jay wanted to call an ambulance, but Lila asked to be taken to the hospital as soon as possible. They drove along the same highway where Jay's wife crashed 3 years ago. This section had a speed limit, and Jay slowed down. Usually, he stopped for a few minutes to honor the memory of his wife, but this time he looked at Lila and didn't stop the car. Lila sat silently and looked at the road. Suddenly, she saw Catherine, Jay's deceased wife, blocking the road for them to stop. Catherine convulsively shook her head, and her long hair flew in different directions like a fan. Lila was very scared, but she asked Jay to stop the car. Jay felt guilty, slowed down, and stopped the car. He went out, as always, for 1 or 2 minutes to honor the memory of his dead wife. Lila understood that Jay couldn't see the ghost. She walked past the ghost, removed the bracelet from her arm, and hung it on the tree that Catherine's car had crashed into. Jay looked at Lila in surprise, but said nothing. It was clear that he was thinking about something. The hospital determined that Lila was pregnant, and they would have a son. Jay rejoiced at this news like a small child. His face glowed with happiness, and he called his brother in Florida to inform him about this event. On the way back, Jay talked to Lila about filling out invitation cards for their guests today. At night, she dreamed of an unfamiliar man who dressed a mannequin in a black wedding dress and convinced Lila that she was obliged to wear it on her wedding day. After that, Lila turned into a monster and saw her own ugly head in Jay's office. In the morning, while passing the room where her wedding dress hung, she saw a ghost wearing a white dress. The woman danced frantically and whispered to Lila to change her dress because it was not white. Lila saw that her dress had become gray, as if it had been sprinkled with dust, and this dust was impossible to shake off. She called Jay and showed him the dress that had changed color. He mumbled, "This is the gardener, there is no one else. I have been noticing him for a long time. But this won't happen again." He left the house and she heard him talking loudly to the gardener before driving away. He returned in the evening with a new dress of a similar design and silently hung it up in their bedroom. "Don't be scared, I fired him," he reassured her. Lila was on the verge of collapse. She asked Jay directly about Elizabeth. "This is my first love," Jay said. "She went to Washington to care for her sick father and didn't answer my letters and calls. She blocked me on all social networks." Then a letter came from her. He pulled out a short letter from Elizabeth with no return address. In the letter, Elizabeth wrote that she had met an older man whom she fell in love with. She wished Jay happiness and asked him to forget about her and not to disturb her. Lila plucked up her courage and brought a letter from the medical trainee. Jay read the letter and turned pale. He nervously ordered Lila to get ready and said, "We're leaving." Lila began to scream that Jay was guilty of all these crimes. Lila thought he was the killer of his wives. He took her by the hand and began to persuade her. She jerked her hand away. At this time, something incomprehensible began to happen in the room. The room filled with gray smoke and silhouettes of ghosts. They moved or flickered strangely, but no one interfered in their quarrel. Among others, she noticed Elizabeth and Catherine. Lila heard what they were thinking. They wanted Lila to submit to Jay. But Lila resisted. She was hysterical, and she did not believe him. The baby cried loudly. The ghosts were numb. Jay released Lila and grabbed his head. He fell to the floor and was motionless. A figure moved slowly from the corner in the gray smoke. Lila felt the beating of her child. He anxiously beat his leg against her stomach. Gray smoke crawled across the floor towards Lila and Jay. Then Lila saw a face, the sight of which plunged her into horror. Long, sharp teeth, foam at the mouth, bloodshot eyes protruding from the sockets, flaring nostrils. Despite this, she recognized him. It was the gardener, whom Jay had fired that afternoon. He croaked, "Your turn has come." 2 lives at once, how lucky I am. She understood that the gardener was this terrible gray shadow. Drool dripped down his long yellow teeth. He enjoyed the long-awaited moment. Lila grabbed Jay's arm and began to pull him towards the exit, but Jay was unconscious. Lila screamed, and in that scream there was all the despair of a woman who cannot protect her child. In that split second, the thought flashed through Lila's head, a hairpin. Pulling the pin out of her hair, she jabbed it into the monster's yellow eye with incredible force. There was an animal growl. The chandelier, in which the light flickered, fell to the floor with a crash. But then babies began to cry from all sides, and women, ghosts of howling, screeching and wheezing, rushed at the monster. Those were the saving moments when Jay and Lila rushed out of the house and into the garage. The car started up, and within a minute, they were driving along a deserted night road. Jay and Lila arrived at Lila's apartment. The first thing they saw when they entered the room was a hairpin and a bracelet that Lila had presented to Jay's dead wife, Catherine. Later, they learned that Jay's house, where he had lived for more than 10 years, had burned down, and the police found charred bones, either of a large lynx or a gorilla. In any case, there were no injured people in the house. This is a sinister and horrifying story about a dark place that plunges its victims into madness. I'm Steve Gloom, an expert in supernatural phenomena, and here's what happened in Oklahoma. Katie stood silently, unable to comprehend how she ended up in this place. She had no keys or phone in her pockets. She found herself in a large room with glass partitions and glass shelves, much like those in supermarkets. Approaching the shelves, Katie opened one of them. It contained packaged food items, with her name written on them. In the adjacent rooms, separated by glass partitions, were other unfamiliar people. Katie knocked on the thick glass, shouted, waved her hands, but the people behaved as if she didn't exist. They lived their own lives, seemingly oblivious to her presence. She couldn't determine whether they couldn't see her or were deliberately ignoring her. She felt lost and didn't know what to do. Questions plagued her mind. Where was she, and how did she end up here? Katie remembered stopping her car just short of reaching her town and deciding to take a walk in a meadow. She had been in a good mood, strolling along a path when she spotted Olivia, a woman who lived near her house in their town. She knew that people disliked Olivia and kept their distance from her. There were many rumors circulating about her. Adults even instructed their children and grandchildren to steer clear of her. Without delving into the reasons behind it, Katie was actually drawn to Olivia for her unique style and her ability to appear flawless. Approaching her without fear, Katie noticed a flicker of anger in Olivia's eyes as she drew closer. The last thing Katie remembered was Olivia's wild dance. Deciding that she needed to regain her sense of reality and find a way out of this strange house, Katie spotted a heavy vase. She began smashing the glass partitions. However, the people she had seen behind the glass were nowhere to be found. A sense of foreboding engulfed the girl's heart. It increasingly felt like she was losing touch with reality. Katie sensed a turbulent energy and saw flickering lights as hideous faces of women and bony hands with skeletal fingers started appearing everywhere. They reached out their hands towards her, emitting repulsive sounds. The girl sensed an unpleasant odor that made her head spin. Overwhelmed by horror at the approaching grotesque figures, Katie felt a deadly danger. Her soul was in turmoil, searching for an escape from this dead end. In fear, Katie dashed towards the only illuminated opening in the room where those flickering beings were absent. The room was brightly lit, as if the light emanated from everywhere. However, there were no windows in this room, which she had hoped to find in order to break and escape from the house. The only things present in the room were a piano and a chair beside it. In fear and desperation, without looking back, she sat down at the piano and began to play. Katie was astonished that her choice fell upon the piece La Campanella, which is considered one of the most challenging compositions ever written by Franz Liszt for piano, based on Niccolò Paganini's violin piece of the same name. Back in her childhood, she had spent a long time practicing Etude No. 3, but she had never been able to play it well. Now, her fingers raced across the keys with incredible speed. Regardless of her own control, the pace of the performance increased, and she realized that this music was transforming into something entirely different, carrying a completely different meaning. She knew that someone stood behind her, leaning against her back, as icy, grotesque hands slowly rested on her shoulders. With the frenzied speed of her playing, the music altered, and it itself became distorted, while her mind seemed to transcend the boundaries of the unknown, delving into something heavy and irreparable. Katie's hands darted even faster across the piano, and as the etude came to an end, the performance started anew, forming a musical temporal loop. Katie looked down and saw muscular, strong bare feet with an abundance of toes, from which flakes of skin or dandruff were falling. Her body stiffened from the cold, but it wasn't the kind of cold one would feel in winter. She felt herself transitioning into another state, growing colder from the creature's breath and its deathly cold hands. Katie caught a dim reflection on the piano of the figure standing behind her. It had a pallid face, white long hair. Particles of white skin floated in the air. Suddenly, she heard an inhuman scream in her mind. Her body was struck with an electric shock. Her hands ceased their movement, abruptly ending her ability to play at such tremendous speed. Unexpectedly, the keys ignited, and fire rapidly spread throughout the instrument. The fire warmed her, and gradually, her sensitivity returned. Simultaneously, she heard a growl. Turning around, she saw the figure in its full height. It stood with its head lowered, white hair obscuring its downturned face. Particles of white skin enveloped it like a cloud. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed that the keys were still moving slowly, as if someone invisible continued to press them. After a few seconds, silence fell upon the room. Everything disappeared. Katie realized she would live. A thought raced through her mind that someone's monstrous plan had failed. Katie stepped outside and easily found the field and her car. As she drove home, she learned the news that Olivia had crashed into a tombstone at the city cemetery at an unimaginable speed and died. The house where Katie had been was discovered. It was a house with a small private property not far from the city. The police found broken display cases with labeled food, a vase, a room with a piano and a chair, and most importantly, particles of skin scattered densely on the floor. Nearby the house, fresh graves and an old burial were found. There was no trace of alcohol or narcotics in the girl's blood. A week later, several people who were considered missing returned home from other cities. They vaguely remembered those events. But when they heard the name of that woman, they wept. Behind this note lies a chilling and horrifying story that took place in the city of Franklin. Isabella found it when she began to suspect that something was wrong with her husband. I, Steve Gloom, will once again plunge us into the world of the supernatural. It all started when Isabella woke up to a sound resembling the roar of a freight train. The ground was shaking, furniture was moving around the bedroom. She jumped out of bed and looked out the window, freezing in place. Right in front of the window, a chasm had formed, and a stream of black sludge was rising from it. Standing in front of the abyss was Henry, her husband. The thick mud was engulfing him. Isabella screamed, trying to overpower the noise, and hurried towards the door to help him. But a ghost of Henry's mother blocked her path. "Stop," the ghost cried out, extending a knife towards her. Kill. Kill. Kill him." Isabella woke up. She could feel her husband's hand on her thigh. "You had that horrible dream again? Did you save me this time?" he asked. Isabella pressed herself against Henry and remained silent. "Did anyone else appear in your dream?" Henry continued questioning. Isabella silently gazed at the raindrops on the window pane and the lights outside. "No one," Isabella weakly replied. She didn't want to upset Henry with her dream, which involved his late mother. In the morning, Isabella woke up late, and Henry had already left for work. There was a bouquet of fresh flowers and a note on the table: "Go somewhere with Sylvia, have some fun. I wouldn't mind if you invite her over for dinner." Isabella felt pleased. Henry always cared for her. He always wanted her to have company, to have friends. But luck was not on her side with friends. One moved to another country and got married, and they stopped communicating. Another went to the mountains and tragically got lost somewhere. The third thanked her for the dress she borrowed for one evening and disappeared. However, Isabella had been friends with Sylvia for 6 months now. Sylvia was a cheerful, lively girl. Isabella cherished their friendship greatly. During the day, Isabella and Sylvia sat in a picturesque spot in the park, and Isabella decided to share her recurring nightmare with Sylvia. Sylvia concluded that they needed to go to the cemetery to visit Henry's mother's grave and bring flowers. She believed that by showing attention and care to Henry's mother's spirit, they could alleviate Isabella's fears. She suggested they go together. Isabella and Sylvia bought flowers, and when they found the grave, they placed the flowers on Henry's mother's tombstone. It brought Isabella some relief, and she didn't notice the figure lurking in the shadows of the trees, watching them. On the weekend, Isabella invited Sylvia to her house for lunch. The meal went smoothly in a friendly atmosphere. Henry made jokes and was charming. As Sylvia was leaving, her gaze fell upon a small portrait of Henry's mother. It was only then that Isabella realized the portrait was in the exact spot where the ghost of Henry's mother with a knife had appeared in her nightmare. At night, Isabella went to get a glass of water and thought she saw the ghostly figure of Henry's mother near the portrait. She rubbed her eyes, and the apparition disappeared. In the morning, when Henry left for work, Isabella approached the portrait and decided to remove a photo from its frame. Inside, she found a folded sheet of paper and unfolded it. It read, "My son, the monster. I know his terrible secret. If he kills me today, please take this letter to the police. He is committing evil in our basement." Isabella couldn't believe it. She didn't know what to do. But she gathered the courage and called her friend Sylvia. Sylvia asked her not to take any action until she arrived. The search for the key didn't take long. In one of Henry's boxing gloves, Sylvia found the key. It was still lunchtime, so Henry couldn't return home. They decided to investigate the basement. Easily opening the doors and propping them with a chair out of caution, they descended downstairs. In the basement, they found nothing out of the ordinary, except for an eerie emptiness. They were about to leave when Sylvia pushed one of the cabinets aside, and the young women saw a small door. Sylvia pulled the handle, but the door was locked. They turned the handle, and the door opened. Inside, along a long corridor, were small cubicles resembling public toilets. Sylvia noticed a switch near the entrance and flipped it. Dim lights flickered on. The air was musty, filled with dust and the stench of decaying flesh. There were no locks on the doors of the cubicles. As they opened the first one, the young women froze. Inside was a frail, pale woman resembling a prisoner, with chains on her legs and arms. Her body was covered in bites, some of which were rotting and oozing blood. She could barely move, her gaze filled with madness. Isabella recognized her friend, who mysteriously disappeared, leaving a letter from another country without a return address, saying she got married and was very happy. Meanwhile, Sylvia peeked into the second and third cubicles and quietly reported that there were other women inside. In the third cubicle, a woman could speak clearly, and Sylvia conversed with her, trying to free her. Tears streamed down Isabella's cheeks as she covered her nose with one hand to block the smell of decaying flesh. With the other hand, she tried to remove the chains. Suddenly, Isabella felt strong hands squeezing her neck. "Is this how you're saving me, my love?" It was Henry, her husband, who suddenly returned from work. He began to choke her, and she lost consciousness. Isabella woke up in the fourth cabin as Henry fastened the chain around her ankles. She noticed several bite marks on her arms, but she didn't care. Isabella realized that resistance was futile. She stared into his face and saw the anger etched on it. His lips were clenched and twisted into a wicked grin, his eyes gleaming with predatory intent. For a moment, she thought she saw long fangs in his mouth. Next to Isabella, she saw a ghost. Without a doubt, it was Henry's mother, and Isabella felt as though she wanted to convey something to her. Isabella longed to understand her, but she vanished. "Darling, this place was meant for your friend, Sylvia," Henry cynically declared as he removed the chain and earrings from her. "But you changed my plans. Now Sylvia will take your place in the upstairs bedroom. And every day, I'll give her your favorite flowers. You're as curious as my mother." Isabella realized that Henry hadn't seen Sylvia, she had hidden somewhere. When the doors closed and Henry extinguished the light, Sylvia approached Isabella in the pitch darkness. She quietly wept and whispered that Henry was a killer and a monster, and that there was always a way out, that she would save them all. Isabella struggled to comprehend Sylvia's words, as if she were in a trance. Sylvia pulled out her iPhone from her pocket to call for help. She asked everyone to hold on, thanking the women who hadn't revealed her. However, she couldn't make the call as there was no coverage in the basement. Isabella rattled the chains, attempting to free herself, but it was impossible. Time dragged on in the darkness, and Isabella and Sylvia didn't know how to save themselves and the other victims. A young woman from the third cabin said there was a small opening in the ceiling above her, and they could try to make a call from there. Isabella heard the voice, and a realization burned within her. All her friends with whom she had maintained relationships in recent years and who had disappeared were here. How blind I've been. Why didn't I see this? Sylvia decided to climb onto Evelyn's shoulders. But it wasn't easy. Although Sylvia was slender, the captive was exhausted, and it was very difficult for her to support Sylvia on her shoulders. Yet, after several attempts, they managed to do it. Sylvia succeeded in dialing emergency services and asking for help. As soon as she finished the call, the lights suddenly came on, and everyone realized that Henry had returned. Sylvia pressed herself against the wall at the end of the corridor, wanting to hide but didn't have time. Standing on the stairs, Henry grinned ferociously and emitted inhuman, muffled sounds. Suddenly, the lights started flickering, and they all heard a loud crackling noise resembling the short-circuiting of high-voltage wires. Sparks began to fly. When the rescuers arrived, they found a man's body with a crushed head in the basement. At the end of the corridor, there was a girl sitting on the dusty floor, and 4 captives were chained to the wall by their hands and feet. Sylvia claimed that behind Henry, a woman in white appeared with a hammer in her hands and struck Henry on the head several times, pushing him down the stairs. Sylvia insisted that it was Henry's deceased mother. She vividly remembered her face from the photographs she had seen in the house. However, no hammer or any other object capable of crushing a skull was found in the basement. This is another mystery that I, Steve Gloom, a specialist in supernatural phenomena, am determined to solve. Subscribe to the channel to learn about the most unique paranormal cases.